One of the Lions' best offensive linemen is seeking a new contract, but should Detroit actually entertain this? Let's talk about it. What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. My name is Miko, and this is your go-to place for all things Lions related. That includes news, updates, analysis, and so much more. Today, we are going to be talking about the reported news about Lions offensive lineman Frank Ragnow seeking a new contract, and that possibly being the reason why we have not seen him currently at OTAs this offseason. Now, this news comes courtesy of Dave Burkett in his most recent observation article about Lions training, or not training camp, but Lions OTAs that the media was actually able to attend this week. Now, in his article, all Dave basically points out is that both Alex Anzalone and Frank Ragnow are away from the team this spring in hopes of landing a new contract. He later followed that up with another article where he does kind of get a little bit more direct when saying that he believes that Frank Ragnow is unhappy with his contract and that is probably why he is seeking a new one. Now, I'm not so sure if I would use the word unhappy because, again, if we're talking about Frank Ragnow and his current contract situation, it's not the worst contract situation that you could have at this time, considering the type of player that Frank is. He is still one of the highest paid centers in the NFL. But with that said, when you have a player of his stature seeking out a new contract, I think it is something worth talking about amongst the fan base because there are a number of things that have to be considered when you talk about giving one of the better players in the NFL, not just on your team, a larger payday. So in this video, let's talk about some of the things that could come into play when we talk about whether or not the Lions should extend Frank Ragnow and what could this mean for the team going forward. We're going to definitely talk about his stats and his accomplishments. Obviously, as an offensive lineman, the stats are going to be a little not like what you're expecting from most players, but we're still going to talk about Frank's impact for this team. We'll also look at his current contract situation to kind of break down where he's currently at and how that could factor into the Lions decision and possibly why Frank is seeking a new deal in the first place. And last but not least, we're obviously going to at least try to give, or at least I'm going to at least try to give my opinion on whether or not this is something that the Lions should actually do and what this could mean for them going forward. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump into the meat and potatoes of this conversation. So first and foremost, if we're talking about Frank Ragnow, we have to talk about what he does on the field. And that really comes down to really two things, really, stats and accomplishments. At the end of the day, what you do in the NFL is the thing that gets you paid. And when it comes to Frank Ragnow, he is by far one of the best players in the NFL at his position. It's not even an argument at this point. He is easily one of the top 3 centers in the NFL, and you can make a really strong argument that he is the best center currently in the NFL. When you look at this past season, Frank played in 16 out of the 18 games that the Lions had this year. He played in all 16 regular season games, and then he obviously played in the one postseason game that they had against Washington. And he was one of the better players at his position. He had an 86.1 offensive PFF grade, as well as a 90.8 run blocking grade, which both had him as third best at his position. You also tack on the fact that he was a second team All-Pro last year, which makes it the third time that he's been an All-Pro in his career, as well as him being a 4-time Pro Bowler. So when it comes down to whether or not he deserves a payday based off of his performance and how he's been playing on the field, I think Frank checks that box fairly well. And it's something that Morgan and I talk about fairly often whenever we are talking about the Lions offensive line and what they are able to do so well. A lot of the limelight lately has been placed on Penei Sewell because he is just that freaky of an athlete and he is so dominant at his position, and he is quickly rising the ranks as easily the best right tackle in football. But that doesn't mean that we should forget about Frank Ragnow, because before Penei was drafted here in Detroit, Frank was that guy, and he was the guy that you really hung your hat on for this offensive line. And even through fighting through injuries and things like that, he has still found a way to be one of the better guys at his position. Again, we're talking about a 3-time second team All-Pro player. And the only reason that I think Frank hasn't been first team more consistently in his career is because you obviously at one point in time had Jason Kelce as the best center in football. And like I said, there are still some good centers in the NFL that I think you can have a really good debate about in terms of who is better. When you talk about the likes of Creed Humphrey, when you talk about Cam Jurgens, those are other guys that are definitely jockeying for that position with Frank. But when you go season by season and what he does in the game as both a run blocker, as someone that has been very, stout in terms of communicating and keeping that offensive line on the same page, he is by far the best that the Lions have seen in a really long time. And it's also very evident when he's not in the game how drastically different this offense looks. So I think when we start to look at that aspect of it, sure, there's a really good reason to at least insinuate and believe that, Frank probably is due a pay raise when you just look at what he's been able to do on the field and what he's been able to accomplish so far in his career. Now, the next thing we have to look at is his current contract situation. Like I mentioned at the top of this video, Dave Burkett at least hinted that, Frank may not be happy with his current contract, which is the contract extension that he signed back in 2021, which was actually a pretty good deal. Frank signed a contract that was worth $54 million and received $42 million in guaranteed. He also received 27.9 fully guaranteed at signing. So it's a very good deal at the time of what the market is. And currently, Frank still has 2 years left on his deal when you look at the 2025 season and the 2026 season. In both of those seasons, he's due $9.15 million in 2025, and then he's also due $11.9 million in 2026. Now, the actual cash commitment to him in 2025 isn't the highest, right? It has him about top 10. He's about sixth in the league at his position with that much money, accounted to him. But where things get interesting, and this is where I can probably see Frank and his representation believing that he's due another contract extension, is the fact that this season and next season, he has $0 guaranteed to his contract. And if you're Frank, that is something that could definitely be alarming considering the position that you play and also taking into account some of the injuries that you've occurred over the last couple seasons. Like we said, he did miss a couple games last year, and obviously he missed a couple games the season before that. So if you're Frank Ragnow, you are definitely probably looking at like, hey, I just want to have a little more insurance when it comes down to being paid the money that I'm guaranteed. Because like right now, he basically just has his base salaries and a couple roster bonuses and a couple workout bonuses that really don't a lot to a whole lot. I think it's somewhere in the range of like $100,000 for one of those bonuses, maybe $150,000 for the other. So you're not talking about a lot of money that's guaranteed to you. And if you're someone of Frank at this point in his career, who is currently, he's 29 years old, it's again, you're probably just looking for a little bit more security for the long term. And when you start to compare his contract currently to the other players at his position, Frank is probably, he's still top 5 at his position in terms of what his total contract earnings is worth. But he's behind the likes of Cam Jurgens, who recently signed a deal this past season, or currently signed a new deal in 2025. Obviously, he's behind Creed Humphrey, who is currently the highest paid center in football when you looked at what his contract was valued at. And then you have Drew Dahlman, the center for the Chicago Bears, who also has a little bit more money allotted to him when you compare him to Frank Ragnow. So if you're talking about a guy, like we talked about his accomplishments a little bit earlier, that is a 3-time second team All-Pro and a multi-time Pro Bowler, it makes a lot of sense that from a, just comparison standpoint in terms of the other guys that play his position who probably haven't accomplished as much as Frank has in his career, it definitely makes sense that he would want to have a pay bump in his contract and make him the highest paid center in football. And that's something that I could definitely understand his approach when you look at his track record, when you look at what he's accomplished, and then you look at what his current contract situation is where he doesn't have any guaranteed money. So I think that's something that definitely his representation is going to take to the table and say like, hey, how can we continue to keep Frank in Detroit for the long haul? Now, the question then becomes, after looking at those things, looking at his accomplishments and looking at his current contract situation, is this a good thing for the Lions? Would a new contract to Frank Ragnow be beneficial to them? And it's kind of a tough question to answer when you consider the situation the Lions are currently in. As we know, going into this offseason, there was a lot of talk about the Lions potentially extending the likes of Kirby Joseph, Aiden Hutchinson, Jamison Williams, Derek Barnes, and the likes. So far, the Lions have been able to take care of some of those players, right? Kirby Joseph got a brand new deal. Derek Barnes got a new deal. Both Aiden Hutchinson and Jamison Williams had their 5th-year options exercised, which gives the Lions a little bit more of a buffer to be able to work towards long-term deals potentially with both of those players. But once you throw the likes of Frank Ragnow into the mix as another guy who needs to possibly get paid, now things get a little tricky. right? In terms of how do you find a way of paying all of these guys the money that you feel like they are worth? Because like I said, we're talking about one of the best centers in football. I think you definitely would like to be able to retain that player. Now, like I said, the thing that I think could possibly give the Lions some amount of buffer and some type of, wiggle room is, first and foremost, we've seen it time and time again. The NFL salary cap is consistently going up, but it's also easily manipulated in how you structure contracts, right? And so if you're talking about someone like Frank Ragnow, we're talking about an extension that you're probably looking in the range of maybe 2 to 3 years. And so that way you can get him more guaranteed money over the next few seasons so that he is taken care of. Now, because he's playing center, it's not like that amount of money that's allotted to him is astronomical, right? I think, Creed Humphrey's contract that he signed back in 2024 was valued at about $72 million. So if you're looking to possibly make, Frank the highest paid center in football, you're probably going north of that. You're probably going somewhere in the range and maybe try to get him to 75 or something like that. But again, that's something that Brad Holmes, Mike Disner can definitely work out to be able to make sure that they appease Frank Ragnow, because he still does have some tread on the tire if Frank is looking to play long term, which I think that is another thing that is beneficial to the Lions, is the fact that if Frank Ragnow's asking for a contract extension, that at least should be a sign that he's looking to continue to play at least for the next, 2, 3, maybe 4 seasons. That is something that's very beneficial, especially when you consider the fact that a couple seasons ago, we were all wondering as a fan base, could Frank be considering an early retirement and being one of those players that retire before they ever reach 30 or as soon as he reaches 30? If he's already looking for more money and he's looking to be extended, that at least gives you some signs that, like, hey, your offensive line can continue to be good even longer into, his career. So while trying to figure out how to balance the money between Frank Ragnow, Aiden Hutchinson, and Jamison Williams isn't a fun situation, I think it's still a good problem to have, especially when you consider the fact that the Lions currently don't have an established backup center to actually replace Frank Ragnow, even if they wanted to move on. They are currently going through the process of OTAs of definitely cross-training second round draft pick Tate Rattlage, and he's taking a lot of reps at center. But taking a guy who primarily played right guard in college, sliding him over to center and expecting him to replace a former All-Pro and Pro Bowler is a really tall task to ask. Not to say that Tate Rattlage isn't up to it, but I think if you're the Lions, you would still like a couple of years of buffer to be able to make sure that even if you do want that type of, transition to happen for Rattlage, that it happens in like the next few years in the same way that the Philadelphia Eagles did that with Cam Jurgens. They didn't just draft Cam Jurgens and immediately have him replace Jason Kelce. They allowed Jurgens to obviously develop and play on that offensive line at one of their guard spots. And then once Kelce decided to hang it up, then they were able to make that seamless transition. I think the Lions could do something very similar with Frank Ragnow, where you take care of him in the interim, and then once he decides that he wants to move on, or once you feel comfortable moving on and allowing Tate Rattlage to play center, you can then make that transition, and now you're in a much more feasible situation when you talk about your salary cap situation. Also, we all know that the Lions offensive line is by far their best unit when you talk about this team from top to bottom. Making sure that you can keep as many of those pieces together, again, for the long haul, is another thing that will continue to keep this team in contention for the next few seasons. So as long as you are able to keep a Penei Sewell, as long as you are able to keep a Frank Ragnow, if you can develop the likes of, Tate Rattlage or Christian Mahogany or Miles Frazier or whatever the case may be, develop one of these young offensive linemen, this can continue to be a really strong unit for the Lions going forward, especially when you consider the backs that you have in the backfield, the quarterback that you have, and the weapons that you have on the outside. So is it the most ideal situation for the Lions? Absolutely not, right? There's a lot of money that has to get spread around, and you're really going to have to start doing some gymnastics to make sure that everyone can get paid. But when it comes down to Frank Ragnow, in my opinion, this is a no-brainer. You have to figure out how to get a deal done for him so that you can continue to keep your best unit, one of the best units in football, going forward. So those are all of my thoughts on the situation, guys. I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section below. What do you guys think about the report of Frank Ragnow wanting a new contract? Do you think that's something that the Lions should actually entertain? Or do you think they should actually start to consider life without Frank Ragnow now and look to move on and possibly look at having a young Tate Rattlage be your starting center, sooner rather than later? Would love to hear all that from you guys in the comment section. Also, if you're looking for any more additional Lions content, you can always check out prideofdetroit.com. We have new articles being written over there all the time. But if you prefer more video content, all you have to do is hit that subscribe button, hit that notification. That's going to help you reach all of our video content here on YouTube. Also be notified when we decide to go live over here on this platform, as well as Twitch as well. So with all that said, I'm Miko. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you guys in the next one.